Hello and welcome to my channel. If you're new here, then don't forget to subscribe. In this video, I will be sharing a video explaining what happened in 1948. Now, this is a video giving us an insight of how Palestine was stolen by Israel. It shows how history has been carefully concealed, purposely distorted, and in the West, largely forgotten. Now, the video shows how hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were violently displaced from their homeland in order to create the state Israel. Here is a video.
This is a story about what happened here in 1948. That history has been carefully concealed, purposefully distorted, and in the West, largely forgotten.
They put our village as an example with what they can do.
The massacre in this village was one of many in a series of catastrophic events that became known as the Nakba, when hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were violently displaced from their homeland in order to create the state of Israel.
In May of 1948, a new Jewish state, Israel, was born in a bath of blood.
The borders of Palestine have been changed forcefully over time, but historically, this region has been home to Palestinians for centuries, with hundreds of villages and thriving cities. One of them being the central city of Jerusalem, with holy sites important to Jewish, Christian, and Muslim people. By the late Ottoman Empire, Palestinians living here were overwhelmingly Muslim, with minority Christian and Jewish native populations too. But regardless of religion, Palestinians were often referred to as Arabs, people of the Arabic-speaking world, despite their distinctive culture.
Palestinians have long distinguished themselves as Ahl Palestine, or the people of Palestine. They developed a distinctive Arabic accent, they developed regional food, regional dress, and family ties.
But by the time World War I began, several key political forces were competing for control of these lands. First, there was a growing Arab political movement, looking for independence from the Ottoman Empire in hopes of a unified Arab state that would include Palestine. Then, there were Zionists, a political group that had one main goal: the creation of a Jewish state. Zionism was a response to an increasingly brutal climate for Jewish people, particularly in Europe and Russia, where there was a massive wave of anti-Semitism, including large-scale attacks in the late 1800s and early 1900s. After briefly considering other areas for a new state, including Uganda and Argentina, Zionist leaders decided on Palestine because of its connection to early religious history. But there was a third key group with political interests here: the British. Control of the region would allow them to expand their spheres of influence and protect trade routes to India. During World War I, since both the British and the Arab independence movement wanted Palestine, they decided to go after the Ottomans together with an important pledge. Through a series of letters in 1916, an Arab leader and a British official agreed that if Arabs would help the British fight the Ottomans and give the British economic and other foreign privileges in Arab lands, in return, the British would recognize and support an independent Arab state. Soon, the Arabs started doing their part in revolting against the Ottomans, making it easier for the British to move in. But the next year, the British issued a new declaration and betrayed the Arabs.
In 1917, Lord Allenby conquered the Holy Land, and the Jews were promised a national home in Palestine.
Without consulting the native Palestinian population, the British issued what's known as the Balfour Declaration, supporting the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. So instead of supporting the idea of Palestine as part of a unified and independent Arab state, the British pledged to help secure this land for Zionists. It was a strategic move. This declaration opened up a pathway for Britain to gain power in Palestine,
under the guise that it was supporting the self-determination of another people, of a people in Palestine who don't reside there yet.
As for Palestine's majority Arab population, the declaration referred to them as non-Jewish communities, who would be given civil and religious rights, but not political rights. A few years later, after World War I ended, Britain gained control of Palestine through a mandate that also required them to put the Balfour plans for Jewish settlement in motion. And they did. Between 1922 and 1931, the Jewish population more than doubled. The migration helped the Zionist movement gain steam, and a slogan took off: a land without people for a people without land.
And it sends a message to Western leaders that the people who had been living in Palestine for generations could just be easily moved elsewhere. The idea was that those inhabitants weren't a people with ties to that land.
Palestine was, of course, a land with a people. In 1931, there were more than 850,000 Palestinian Arabs in the region, still the vast majority. But with the rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party in particular,
hate became a rallying call.
Jewish flight from Europe became even more urgent, and Palestine started to see the biggest wave of Jewish immigration yet. Violence broke out, rooted in tensions over land. Jewish settlers purchased swaths of fertile land and evicted tenant farmers, creating a crisis of hundreds of thousands of landless, dispossessed Palestinian Arabs. Though Palestinians fiercely rebelled against both British colonial forces and Jewish settlers, they were brutally crushed by the British.
They put in Palestine more troops to repress that rebellion than they had stationed in India at that time, all of India.
These trooped thousands of Palestinians, including many of their leaders, and the British began training and arming Zionist militias to suppress the rebellion too. But the rebellion continued. So, in an attempt to prevent further Palestinian resistance, the British began to limit Jewish immigration into Palestine. This ended up angering Zionist extremists, leading to more violence. So, in 1947, after decades of trying to manipulate both Palestinian Arabs and Zionists to keep their control over Palestine, Britain gave up and handed the question of Palestine to someone else.
To the United Nations also came the problem of Palestine. In recent years, this small country had been the scene of disorder and bloodshed.
They figured, there is this new thing called the United Nations. Here, in your lap, Palestine, first gift. So the United Nations has now to figure out, how do you disentangle this thing that the British helped create?
A UN special committee proposed the land be divided into two states, a Jewish state and an Arab state, with Jerusalem as a separate UN-controlled entity. It was called the Partition Plan of 1947. The plan shocked Palestinians.
We could not accept the partition plan because at that time the population, we were almost 2-to-1.
But the plan proposed giving over half the land, and often the most fertile areas, to the Jewish state.
From a purely pragmatic perspective, the partition plan didn't make much sense for Palestinian Arabs.
That wasn't the only problem with the plan. Within this proposed area of the Jewish state were hundreds of thousands of Palestinian Arabs, including both Muslims and Christians, who had lived there for generations.
On a moral level, the idea of making hundreds of thousands of Palestinian Arabs minorities in their own homeland seemed unjust and unfair.
In November 1947, the UN put the plan to a vote. In the aftermath of the Holocaust, and after lobbying from US leaders and Zionists, the UN voted in favor of partition.
And finally, a momentous decision to partition the Holy Land's 10,000 square miles.
Britain announced their mandate over Palestine would end on May 15, 1948, even as Palestinians continued to reject the UN's decision to partition the land.
After the partition took place, in 1947, we really were scared something might happen to us.
Today, between 1,600,000 and 750,000 Israelis live in these sizable settlements, equivalent to roughly 11% of the total Jewish Israel population. They live beyond the internationally recognized borders of their state, on Palestinian land that Israel occupied in 1967, now comprising East Jerusalem and West Bank. Since then, the Israeli government has openly funded and built settlements for Israeli Jews to live there, offering incentives and subsidized housing. So why have these housing compounds caused so much rancor and been called a threat to the prospect of peace in the Holy Land? Contrary to common belief, settlements are a legacy of the pre-1948 period before the creation of Israel. Now, in the 1880s, the community of Palestinian Jews known as the Yishav, pardon me if that's not the correct pronunciation, amounted to 3% of the total population. They were apolitical and did not aspire to build a modern Jewish state. But in the late 19th century, the Zionist movement, a political ideology, grew out of Eastern Europe, claiming that Jews were a nation or race that deserved a modern Jewish state. Now, the movement, citing the biblical belief that God promised Palestine to the Jews, began to buy land there and build settlements to strengthen their claim to the land. The distribution of the settlement determined the map of the proposed United Nations petition plan for Jewish and Palestinian states in 1947. By 1948, prior to the ethnic cleansing of Palestine by the Zionist movement, Jews had control over less than 6% of the land. As European Jews began to colonize Palestine, many pushed by anti-Semitic persecution in Europe. Now, the balance of land control between Palestinians and immigrant Jews shifted significantly. The project was facilitated by the British, who were occupying Palestine from 1917 to 1947, with the aim of building a Jewish state. Now, between 1922 and 1935, the Jewish population rose from 9% to nearly 27% of the total population, displacing tens of thousands of Palestinian tenants from their lands as Zionists bought land from absentee landlords. Now, under the 1947 UN petition plan, Jews were allocated 55% of the land, encompassing many of the main cities with Palestinian Arab majorities and the important coastline from Haifa to Jaffa. Now, the plan would deprive the Palestinian state of key agricultural lands and seaports, which led the Palestinians to reject the proposal. Shortly after that issuance of UN Resolution 181 that called for a petition, war broke out between Palestinian Arabs and Zionist armed groups who, unlike the Palestinians, had gained extensive training and arms from fighting alongside Britain in World War II. Now, this is basically the history of how Palestine was stolen by Israel. After listening to all this, what is your take on this video? Share your comments below. Thank you for watching and see you in my next video.